for class, and it's always a wonderful time when we can get together and discuss God's Word for us. Um, and I know that God blesses us anytime we talk about Him and learn about Him. And obviously, this last several months, year, we've had a lot of different changes have been happening, but it's something that God blesses. And regardless of these changes, don't get your spirit down. Don't let your spirit get down, because God is with us. God is with us. So right now we're going to continue our series with some different biographies, and want to go through a little bit more of a story-like today with the one we're going to go through. So I actually wanted to talk about a number of different things, but one of the first things is just common sense. One of the things that I grew up learning about was that if you ever wanted to know what the weather's going to be, you can turn the Weather Channel on, and they'll have their satellites and everything else, or you can do the common sense thing and look out the window, and you can see what's coming if you look the direction that the wind comes. But there's also witnesses or people with great learning dealing with weather for a very common sense reason, and that's your farmers. You want to know what the weather is going to be, talk to a farmer. They spend time outside working with it. They watch the clouds. They do everything. It affects them personally. And so they pay attention long term, what's it going to be. We don't have the Weatherman's Almanac. We've got the Farmer's Almanac. There's a reason for that. It's because there's a lot of common sense with that. Another group of people that watches the weather very intently, they pay attention to what's going on. It's fishermen and sailors. They pay attention to what that is because it affects them personally. Perhaps their lives, their very lives, but also their income. It affects them, so it's important to them. They pay attention to it. So one of the things in our story is going to have to do with sailors and their reactions. So going way back in history, Solomon. We all know about Solomon. Wisest man ever. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time dealing with Solomon specifically, but starting with Solomon for our story today. He had many, many building projects that they did. The kingdom grew stronger and larger and wealthier under Solomon. And yet not everybody was happy. They did have slaves. They had, it was a whole society of people. So like anything in life, there's never just a very quick, simple, easy answer that explains everything. And one of the people that was during Solomon's time was Jeroboam. And during his time, he actually oversaw a number of the building projects. He was a leader. He was smart. There's a lot of things he did. But when things started to come apart a little bit, he's actually went to Egypt for quite a long time. And then he came back. And then after Solomon died, there was a lot of warring throughout Israel. And then we had a split. And the 10 northern tribes ended up basically revolting. And they ended up having a civil war. And I'm always astounded at the numbers that we talk about when we have some of the wars back then. There's an account that that Jeroboam became the first leader of those northern tribes, the first king, if you will, of those northern 10 tribes. And they were warring against the south also, not just against Assyria and the different countries around, but it was a civil war. And there's an account that Jeroboam from the north had an army of 800,000. And Judah had, I believe it was 300,000. A lot of people, a lot of soldiers, but less than the north had. And in this account, God was blessing the south more. God was blessing Judah more. And the north lost 500,000 soldiers. 500,000 soldiers in this civil war from Israel, from those northern 10 tribes. Very, very interesting when you hear about those numbers. Later on, hundreds of years later, which we're going to get to in this story, hundreds of years later, they talk about that northern area had a population probably somewhere around 300 to 400,000 people. They lost more soldiers during that time earlier than they had total population later on. Obviously, a lot of things can change. A lot of things can change. So it's something when you look at history, it's like, boy, there's big swaths of things that happen. And some of the stuff is just amazing when you think about how intense some of this stuff was. So Jeroboam ended up leading that northern tribe, and he wasn't a good guy. He led that north specifically to not go to Jerusalem to worship God, not to go to the temple there, which is the way that the Jews did then. They set up temples other places. They set up idols other places. And he set up guard towers or whatever exactly it was. He set up things to keep people from going south because he was very, very afraid that if the people from those northern tribes went to Jerusalem in order to worship, that they were going to be drawn away from what he was trying to do. They were going to be drawn back towards God. And he was afraid of that. He didn't want that. So they set up all this stuff. Many, many years later, and this is, I believe that was sometime, we estimate around the year 930 BC. So about 930. 13 kings later in the north. 13 kings later, somewhere around the year 780 BC. So it's been a bunch of years. But 13 kings later, we get Jeroboam the second. So a lot of times you think, hey, I got Jeroboam the second, very next king. Well, there's actually 12 in between that were there. So a long, long time period. And Jeroboam was one that had been prophesied about, that he was going to restore that northern border. He was going to bring things closer, and they were going to expand back. So what exactly does that mean? So now we get into one of my fun things, is we get into maps. And of course, I have this wonderful map right in front of you here. But I know a lot of us have got a lot of these things in our minds, and you've also got maps available. So if you've got a map available, a lot of times people on their tablets or computers or phones, if you look up Nineveh, the city of Nineveh, and take a look in where that is. If you don't have a map available, I can talk you right through that pretty easily. So if you're looking at a map of Israel, and you've got the Jordan River, it'll be on my right side, so you guys are going to have to go opposite of me. So let's switch that. I'll try to switch. We'll see if I can maintain it. So the Jordan River is on the left side, so your right side. And if you go north, you've got the Sea of Galilee up near the north. You've got Sea of Galilee over here on the north part, that's right. And then when you go further up from that, there's actually another small lake that's connected. A lot of people don't realize that. The Jordan River actually goes a little bit further north. And then north of that, there's a valley. So you're still up in a mountainous country, but north of that, there's a valley. And then it opens up. From there, many miles further north of that. When you get up into that area, if you go east, I think it's about 400, 500 miles. That's where you're going to find Nineveh. So if you're talking about from down in the Sea of Galilee area, you're really talking about 550 miles, something like that. Northeast would be where you'd find Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. And we hear about Assyria a lot of times throughout the Bible. We hear about modern-day Syria, not as large as Assyria. Assyria in the Bible times often was a very large empire, covered many, what we would think of different countries now, covered many areas, sometimes all the way down through Egypt. So this map area, you often hear part of this, I believe it's called the Fertile Crescent, or you'll hear different terms for that. And when you're from Babylonia, even further east, if you follow the rivers, there's a fertile green area, if you will. It's kind of a crescent. It goes up and around right through Assyria, and then down through Israel, and down through that way. And that would be where you would travel. If I'm traveling that distance from Babylon over there, I can either tear straight through several thousand miles of desert and sand, or I can try to follow the rivers, which is probably where the cities are, because there's rivers, there's water, there's life there that they're able to do. So they would follow that. The traveling often was through that crescent and down through there. The traveling area that you would do came right through that valley right above Israel. So it was part of Assyria, but it came right down through that valley and funneled right down in to Israel. But when you're starting to get down towards Israel, that's going to be a mountainous area in the middle, kind of the opposite of what we've got here in Oregon. I know Frank has talked about this before, where they've got the mountains in the middle and the valleys, at the ocean and down at the Jordan River on the sides. But most of that area, the cities were often up in a mountain area, following through there, and that lined up perfectly with that valley that was coming down from the north. So what Jeroboam the second did was he restored Israel's earlier northern border, which went way up. So what we think about in modern day Israel is further down, just a little bit north of the Sea of Galilee. He actually restored way up through that valley. And what that does is, politically, it gives you a choking point where all that travel, all the trade, Babylon to Egypt, and all these things going back and forth, you had a way of controlling some of that. A lot of that, because they had to come through you. But here's the downside. That's the way the armies came too. They would come down through there. And so when you'd have a larger empire like Assyria that's growing and trying to expand, they're marching right through you to get to where they want to go. And so that they put Solomon in a very, very good place because travel came to him and all of that story. But if you're on the downside of that, if you don't have God's favor, you've got those armies coming at you and not necessarily bringing good things to you. And that's a lot of what was happening right then during this time period. So we've got an idea of where Nineveh is, and I think most of us have an idea where Nazareth is, just a little bit southeast of the Sea of Galilee. There's a very small town just north of that, 3 to 5 miles, depends on which part of town you start in, I guess, but it's a very small town just north of Nazareth, which is actually nothing there right now, but it's called Gath-Hepher, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Gath-Hepher. And it's just a little village, and it actually still has some ruins that are there now. And that ends up playing a very important role in our story today. A couple other cities that we look at is Joppa. So when you're up in the northern part of Israel, and you go straight down to the Mediterranean Sea, Joppa, which even today is going to be a major port. So that's a port for the trade going basically east. Anything east is going to go through there. Why would you send stuff through a port through Joppa rather than just carrying things around? Because I don't want to walk all that way if I can take a ship and get to what we now think of Greece and Italy and Spain and all those areas, those modern day countries now, but all that area, if I can get a ship and sail there, much, much, much easier and faster. And I would assume less dangerous. If I can survive the ship ride, then it's there. But on those roads, who knows who is around the next bend ready to attack me. And so Joppa is going to be a major one. And another city is Tarshish, which I don't think we know exactly where Tarshish is. I don't believe it's a modern day place that they know, but where they speculate that was a major port that was somewhere near what we would call now the southern part of Spain. So the very, very eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, down at the bottom part of what we would call Spain. It was somewhere right in there. So from Joppa, or in that area, over to Nineveh is probably about 550 miles. But from Joppa to Tarshish, they estimate at about 2,500 miles. So quite a bit further in the opposite direction. So that's kind of the map layout of what we're talking about for today. So I've got Jeroboam II that restored the border, and I believe it's called the Hamath Valley or the Lebo-Hamath Valley, and that's that valley. And then right above, I believe the valley is called Lebo-Hamath, and then right above that is the Hamath area. So that's the entrance to Hamath, and that's what that valley is called. So if you find that on a map, that may be a name that you'd see there. So we've got that map laid out, and I've already mentioned that we want to listen to sailors and farmers about what the weather's going to do. So in our story, we actually want to go to the book of Jonah. So if you haven't picked up on it yet, we're talking about Jonah today. Jonah was one of the prophets. And of course, he's famous. I don't think there's very many of us that wouldn't have an idea for what he did. He got swallowed by the big fish. But I want to back up to that first part of the story just a little bit. And let me just read the first part, starting in Jonah chapter 1, starting with verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. So this wasn't just a little storm. This was threatening to break up the ship. These guys would have been terrified at that point. Then the mariners were afraid, and they each cried out to their God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, What do you mean, you're sleeping? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. So I don't know how far, and I don't think it really matters necessarily to this telling of the story, but I don't know how far they got away from Joppa. But we know they were out in the ocean, so they were away from land, at least some. And this huge storm came up. Well, these sailors would have had storms before. That's what they did as a living. They would have gone back and forth and through the ocean and carrying cargo and in and out of different ports. But this storm was different, and they knew it was different. So this wasn't just a matter of, hey, they got surprised by a storm, because they watch for storms. They know what happens there. This was something different, enough that they were praying to their gods. It's like, we don't know what's happened. We don't know what's the fault here. They knew there was something bigger going on. rather than just a storm blew in. And I'm always taken back with, and he was asleep. He was fast asleep down in the hold in the ship. And I always think back, just jumps in my mind as far as for Jesus sleeping when he was in the boat, and they were like, "Why are you asleep? How can you do that?" Well, that was the situation here. How on earth could you be asleep through this? So in verse 7, and they said to one another, "Come, let's cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." They knew that there was something bigger going on. They cast lots, and it fell to Jonah. So as the story goes, they talk to Jonah. Jonah says, "It's me. God's after me. I was running away from what God was wanting me to do, and I ran away." So they're throwing all the cargo over. And I think the natural thing would be, dude, you're going over the ship. You're going overboard. We're getting rid of you. But that's not actually what the sailors did. Let's see, I lost my verse here, but right down here, just beyond here, they actually tried everything they could to row to shore. They were going to get back to safety, and they were taking Jonah with them. So even though they figured out it was Jonah, and they wanted to get rid of him, but these guys weren't murderers. These were regular guys doing their job. I'm just trying to sail a ship, and they're faced with this. Jonah talks them into it, is because they were on the verge of breaking up. Jonah talks them into it that they just need to throw him overboard. Get rid of him, and he'll do that. And that's exactly what happened. So they picked up, in verse 15, so they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So when they threw Jonah overboard, the raging stopped. So what would a reasonable person think? They're already praying to their gods. What is it? Jonah told them correctly, "It's me. I'm the cause of this." And they threw him overboard. I think that would change you. It's not just a matter of, "Woo, we're safe." It's like, no, this would change you. Whoever that guy was, we don't know who that was. Somebody, he just bought a ticket. But whoever that was, his God has this kind of power. His God can take care of that. We prayed to our gods, nothing. He prayed to his God, and he said it was him. We threw him over. We're safe. So it changed them enough that they feared the Lord, and they offered sacrifices to him, and they made vows. It doesn't tell us what the vows were, but a reasonable person's going to be going, "I'm following you. I'm following you the rest of my life. Whatever it is." So I think the reasonable thing to assume is that these sailors got some faith. I think they got some faith in them because of these miracles that they realized were miracles. They knew that wasn't a normal storm, and they also knew that a storm like that naturally doesn't just stop. So they knew that there was something bigger going on. It doesn't tell us anything following in that story exactly what happened with the sailors, but I'm thinking as soon as they got to land, they were talking about this to everybody they could find. I don't see how that would be anything but reasonable. This has changed them. They've made their vows. They're going to be living their lives differently. Now, I don't know how far they had gotten through into the Mediterranean, so where the next land would have been, but they would have found a port and started talking. And what happens when you see people like that are talking like that? Word starts spreading. We've all seen that before. Word starts spreading. So that's something that from the very beginning of this, we followed Jonah through the story, but there's a big story right here where God is working with those sailors in their lives. So then Jonah's in the water. At that point, he's probably thinking, okay, I'm going to drown, I'm dead. But that's not what happened. God sent a big fish. People speculate what kind of fish it was. I don't really care. It was big enough to swallow him whole. It was a big fish, whatever it was. And for whatever reason, God blessed it in a way that Jonah wasn't killed. He was alive in this fish. And so when we follow into the next chapter, Jonah is giving us his prayer that he said while he was in the big fish's stomach. So it wasn't just that he was knocked out and just sort of a passenger inside of this fish. He was alive and he was awake. He understood what was going on, and he was praying to God. So at that point, Jonah physically wouldn't have known what happened with the ship. He wouldn't have known what happened to the sailors. God's already worked a miracle with him. But this is what Jonah is praying. I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All of the waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head and at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed over me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So Jonah is turning. Jonah's turning. He understands God is in control in all of this. So Jonah has not denied that at all. But what was it that caused Jonah to run in the first place?
Somebody told me a long time ago, I kind of like it. Israel's not occupied, or Judah is not occupied country, Israel. If the Lord said, come and go preach to your occupiers. I don't want to preach to my occupiers. I want them destroyed. I'm going the other way. Maybe not. But I kind of like
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know if everybody heard that, but he was just talking about that Jonah having that attitude of, I don't want to go and preach to my occupiers. We were talking about those as the Syrians, and as they were expanding through there, guess what? They were coming down through that valley and expanding all that. So if you've got any kind of interactive map that you've been looking at, you show different ages where there's part where Assyria was north, but at some points it actually was all the way through Egypt, which definitely encompassed this whole area. And even through the desert, straight over to Babylon. At some points, Assyria was huge as an empire. Nineveh was the capital of that. We have an account a little bit later here in the book that Nineveh had 120,000 people just in that one city. So I don't know what the population was of the whole country or the empire, but just the one city was 120,000 people. That's a decent-sized city now. It's not huge, but that's a decent-sized city, and they didn't have the technology and the high-rises and everything that we have now. So that would have been quite an expanse of a city in order to have then. So very, very powerful city within a powerful empire. Frank, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I guess a couple things. One is, didn't Jonah later, in fact, after the city, he had preached, getting ahead of ourselves, I guess, but he had preached, and then the city repents, and he goes and pouts, because this is exactly what I was afraid of, Lord. And And so, yeah, that was kind of one of his reluctance. It seems like he says it himself later in the book.
Yeah, he was reluctant, really, as we were hearing just a minute ago about, well, these are like our occupiers. Now, remember that Jeroboam II had expanded their territory up through that valley. Well, where are they taking that land from? The Assyrians. So this wasn't a friendly neighbor. This is not a friendly neighbor, and this is a very powerful neighbor. So, yeah, especially with Jonah being from that little town just north of Jerusalem, Gath Hefer. With him being from there, he was on the northern part of there, a little bit more of a border town, if you will. Maybe not exactly on the border, but more like that. They would have had a lot of interaction with the Syrians coming down. And every indication is that Jonah himself was not happy about dealing with the Assyrians, and he didn't want them repenting. He wanted them killed and gone. It was, I don't think he made any bones about that. Yeah.
You mentioned in conquest, and there was a lot of that, of course, but the Assyrians were amongst, if we can rate them, amongst the worst. If you had somebody come into your city to conquer it, you don't want them. These guys were wretched and cruel and intent on making examples. And they wanted you afraid, because you're a lot easier probably to govern. But they did fun things like in one city they took the governor and skinned him and nailed his height to the door. They like to impale people, fun things like that.
Yeah, very, very, very brutal.
I might have kind of sided with Jonah on this one.
Yeah. Yeah, but really just not even to the point of being brutal, but just very, very, I don't know what the word would be, beyond brutal, because you're not just killing somebody, you're more than humiliating them. I mean, you are just, it's just amazingly dark, all the things like that they would do. Yeah, this was, so on a physical standpoint, it's very easy to understand where someone would not want to go talk to him in the first place, but the other is, I'm really finding it hard to wish them well. And that's what God was asking Jonah to do. He was telling Jonah to do is, I want you to go and preach to them, get them to repent. And Jonah's like, I don't know. I'm heading out. I'm headed toward Tarshish. Obviously, that wasn't to be, and so he came back. So, Frank, do you have something else?
Well, it's kind of going back a little bit, but I love the way you have told the whole story here and given the background. And one other thing is complete conjecture on my part, but remember how these sailors that you talked about, remember where they were going, right? They were going to this place called Tarshish. Now, is that related to Tarsus, where we know another fellow was from? Josephus says it was, actually. So there's a debate there.
Mm-hmm.
If it was, remember that Paul grew up in a Jewish home in a very, very Greek city, in a very, very Greek city. Was that kind of the original planting of followers of God, those sailors, that ended up landing there? I assume they went on to their destination of Tarsus. Who knows? But kind of fun to think about.
Well, it was a major trading city, and they were alive and had their ship. They would have continued trading, possibly with a different attitude, but they would have continued their jobs, and that would have been, at some point, probably going to Tarshish again and going back to Joppa again. That was what they did.
Originally reluctant preacher of God. So anyway.
Yeah, it's funny how God brings all these things together. Now we talk about, it's a smaller world than you think, the way you can meet up with people, things like that. Well, it's the same thing there. God's always worked in that kind of way. He puts people in the right place and maybe sends them on the right path to make other contacts later on. I've had interaction with a number of different missionaries, and there's one in particular that I spent a lot of time with, Joe Shulam, and he used to talk about that there'd be people that he would come in contact with, and then he would just never hear from him again. They've moved on to another country, whatever it was, and he wouldn't hear from him. And there was this one in particular that he heard from. It was about 20 years later, and he ran into somebody who's a Christian, and the person from another country, several countries over, had told Joe that he became a Christian because of the preaching of somebody in this other city, several countries over, and it turned out to be one of those people that Joe had taught 20 years earlier. And Joe had no idea, and there had been a church planted, and now he had a connection there, and it just strengthened Joe's heart so much, because he said, look, my job's to preach and to plant the seeds. I'm not always the harvester, and that's okay. That's God's job. But he would always talk about that he was so blessed to be able to get that story back, that to see the growth of something that he had done. And so God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes you hear those answers. Sometimes that's for somebody else, and we don't have to worry about that. But getting back to Jonah here, that was Jonah. He didn't want to talk to Nineveh, and for a lot of good reasons. On a physical standpoint, this was not a nice place, and not a nice king, and not a nice situation at all. They'd been fighting with the south, with Judah, but then they had all of this other stuff going on with a bigger empire just barreling right through all of them to go. So a lot going on. So as the story goes, Noah, boy, I really changed gears. As the story goes, Jonah did go to Nineveh, and again, it was a large city. So he said he walked into the city for a day. He'd been there a day. So I don't know if that was solid traveling for a day or if he had been there for a day. But after he had been in the city for a day, he was preaching to them, and he was telling them, in 40 days, Nineveh is going down. And they believed him. So God worked in that, and I don't know exactly how he worked in that. And I don't know exactly, it doesn't give us his exact words of how he preached it and explained it and everything else. But Jonah was obviously able to convince them because they turned. It says in the book of Jonah here that the people of Nineveh repented and started fasting and praying to God to not do this to them. And then the word got to the king. So it doesn't indicate specifically that Jonah spoke directly to the king, but word got to the king of this, and he repented as well. And then the king ended up sending out an edict throughout all the land. So the entire empire is the indication, sent out an edict that everybody, including their animals, were supposed to fast and pray. So this was huge, and this wasn't any indication that they were doing lip service to this. The indication was they really repented. So I don't know exactly how he said this, but the people of Nineveh seriously really did repent, enough that God accepted it. So after he preaches to them, and they start doing that, and this is what Frank was alluding to earlier, was after he preached to them, he goes out and he sits on a hill, I would assume, looking out over the city, and because the message was that in 40 days, you guys are going down. Well, Jonah probably kind of liked giving them that message, although he probably felt like they might not get out of there alive, but he kind of liked giving that message. He'd already indicated that he didn't like them and everything. So he goes out and he sits there, and they're repenting and they're doing whatever, but at that point, on a human standpoint, Jonah's kind of like, well, okay, whatever, but God's getting you. I mean, it's a done deal. God's already said that you're going down. So he goes out and he watches, and he's sitting up on this hill, and then we've got another story that kind of continues this part. And then we kind of look into kind of where Jonah is. So where Jonah is, and I believe this is going to be in chapter 4. So in Jonah chapter 4, this is after he had preached and they were repenting. So starting in verse 1, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is what Frank alluded to earlier. Jonah said, well, if I go and preach to them, they're going to repent. I don't want them to repent. I'm off to Tarshish. So that's exactly what he had said. And so he's almost rebuking God. He's just saying, isn't that what I told you was going to happen? And that is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore, now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under a shade, sat under it in shade, till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade for his head and to save him from discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But then dawn came, and the next day God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. So again, this was a miracle. This wasn't a plant just happened to be there. It came up overnight. It was very quick. And after, so when the sun rose, God appointed a scorching wind, east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die, and he said, it is better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? He said, yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in the night and perished in the night. And should not I pity Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right from their left, and also much cattle? So Jonah is still angry. And now he's angry to the point of he's sitting there to watch what's going to happen to them, and he doesn't even do anything to help himself. He just sits there. Kind of the indication, I'm sitting in the middle of the desert, sitting in the sun, waiting to die. You got to be pretty angry to have that kind of reaction. So, it just doesn't even make sense to be that angry. But of course, this is coming from a Jesus perspective, that he hadn't had Jesus at that point because Jesus came later. But Jonah was to that point, and he was that angry about the whole situation. Because at that point, he was realizing that Nineveh was repenting and that God was relenting and was not going to destroy them. So in this story, we never really are told specifically if Jonah ever relents from his anger. It just sort of stops there and just sort of leaves us with, so what happened with Jonah after that? But I don't think that's actually the point. The point is going to be, what does he do with that? Where does he go from there? And the takeaway from us is when God is calling us to do things or to not do things, well, what do we do with it? It might not be convenient for us, but God calls us to do things today. What do we do with that? And what if it's for our enemy, whether it's a person who lives next door or another country or whatever? What if it's doing something good for an enemy of ours? What is this telling us to do? How do we live our lives so that we don't have this bad expression of anger, which is not what we're called to be like? So Jonah did deliver that message, but we don't have the indication here that he repented. Nineveh did, But Jonah held on to it. So it's a very interesting thing on there. So, and I know we're just about out of time here, so what I wanted to point out was, so the takeaway from this is the book of James. Read the book of James. That's your homework. James, like a lot of books in the Bible, but James, in a very short way, it's an easy read, very quick, easy read, talks about how to live in a Christian way, how to live a Christian life. So what's our takeaway from this story? Well, sure, we can go and help people, but if God's just forcing us into that, well, what's our reaction? How do we live? Read through the book of James, and then ask that for yourself. Where are you supposed to go from there? That's all I had. Thank you.